Throughout history, certain criminals became so terrifying that entire cities lived in fear of them. One claimed black magic gave him supernatural powers, another convinced people he could transform into a wolf, and one of the most disturbing killers in American history wrote a letter so horrifying that investigators refused to release it to the public. These are sick serial killers who terrified entire countries. Before modern forensic science, investigators relied mostly on witnesses, confessions, and rumors. This meant that many cases quickly turned into legends, with stories becoming more exaggerated over time. Some criminals became almost mythical figures, surrounded by rumors of supernatural powers or unbelievable crimes. And the first killer on this list is a perfect example. Our story begins in the late 1500s with a man named Peter Nears. During this time, traveling between towns in Europe could be extremely dangerous. Remote roads and forests were often controlled by criminal gangs that attacked travelers and merchants. Authorities believed Peter Nears was the leader of one of these gangs. He and his group were accused of committing a shocking number of murders across several regions. Over time, stories about him became darker and more mysterious. Many people believed Near practiced black magic and carried a strange bag filled with objects he believed gave him supernatural powers. Some legends even claimed he could become invisible while committing his crimes. In 1577, authorities captured him and forced him to confess to dozens of murders. But somehow he managed to escape and disappear for several years. Eventually, he was recognized at an inn and captured once again. This time, there would be no escape. His execution lasted several days and was meant to send a terrifying message to others. Even by the brutal standards of that era, it was remembered as one of the harshest punishments of the time. But the next case would become even stranger. In the late 1500s, a German farmer named Peter Stump became the center of one of Europe's most bizarre criminal cases. Under interrogation, Stump confessed to practicing dark magic since childhood. He claimed that the devil had given him a magical belt that allowed him to transform into a wolf. Because of this confession, many people believed a real werewolf was responsible for a series of killings. The story spread rapidly across Europe. Pamphlets describing the so-called werewolf of Bedburg were printed and distributed widely, turning the case into one of the earliest crime stories to spread across the continent. Whether these confessions were real or forced remains unclear, but the fear surrounding the story caused authorities to deliver an extremely harsh punishment meant to calm the public and end the panic. Nearly 300 years later, another killer would create one of the most famous mysteries in history. In 1888, London became the center of worldwide attention. In the Whitechapel district, several women were murdered under similar circumstances. Newspapers quickly gave the unknown killer a name that would become legendary: Jack the Ripper. The crimes shocked Victorian society. Newspapers covered every detail and fear spread throughout the city. Police launched one of the largest investigations of the time. Thousands of people were questioned. Dozens of suspects were investigated. Despite the massive investigation, the killer was never identified. More than a century later, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. But the next criminal on this list shocked the United States. Albert Fish is often considered one of the most disturbing criminals in American history. His early life was filled with trauma. As he grew older, his behavior became increasingly disturbing. In 1928, Fish abducted a young girl named Grace Budd after convincing her parents he was taking her to a birthday party. For years, the case remained unsolved. Then in 1934, Grace's family received an anonymous letter describing the crime in disturbing detail. Investigators eventually traced the letter to a boarding house where Fish had once lived. This discovery led to his arrest. In 1936, he was executed in the electric chair. But the next killer managed to avoid capture for years despite leaving a trail of victims. Andrei Chikatilo grew up during one of the most difficult periods in Soviet history. Beginning in the late 1970s, a series of murders began appearing across parts of the Soviet Union. For years, investigators struggled to identify the person responsible. Eventually, a detailed psychological profile helped investigators narrow their search. In 1990, after years of investigation, Chikatilo was finally arrested. He later confessed to dozens of murders. In 1994, he was executed. Luis Alfredo Garavito became one of the most notorious criminals in Latin American history. Because his crimes took place across many regions, investigators struggled for years to connect the cases. Finally, in 1999, evidence left behind near one of the crime scenes helped investigators identify the suspect. Garavito was arrested and eventually confessed to an enormous number of murders. The court sentenced him to more than 1,800 years in prison. However, Colombian law limited the maximum prison sentence, meaning he would serve far less time than the total sentence suggested. Garavito died in prison in 2023. Stories like these remind us how much criminal investigations have evolved over time. from medieval confessions and superstition to modern forensic science and psychological profiling. But one thing hasn't changed: human fascination with the darkest stories in history. Cases like these continue to fascinate people around the world. They show both the darkest parts of human history and the long effort to improve justice systems and criminal investigations. And while many of these crimes happened decades or even centuries ago, their stories are still remembered today.